70s, John Carpenter gave us Halloween. In the 80s, Wes Craven gave us A Nightmare on Elm Street. And this decade, James Wan has given us The Conjuring. Now, in 2020, Glenn Danzig gives us VEROTIKA. Now, why do I mention those other films along with VEROTIKA? Well, because I want to be the only person to ever have those three movies in the same sentence as VEROTIKA. In actuality, I would much more expect to see VEROTIKA mentioned in the line of Tommy Wiseau's The Room and Plan 9 from Outer Space. That's the kind of movie that we're dealing with here. And before we go into the review, I feel there are going to be some Glenn Danzig fans here that will just like this movie regardless and say I don't understand it. But I'd like to remind you that this channel predominantly reviews low-budget B-movies. I'm very well aware of the restrictions of a low-budget B-movie, and you can still have a great movie. So, but what is this film about? Well, it's actually a three-story anthology movie directed and written by Glenn Danzig, who also does the music for this. Now, if you're not familiar with Glenn Danzig, he is a kind of metal punk singer who once fronted the band The Misfits and has had kind of a solo career as well. He's also dabbled in the world of comics, and these kind of stories are actually based on his kind of anthology comic book series. I actually had a few issues of the VEROTIKA comics, including the infamous banned issue. Now, although I did have some in the comic, I don't think I had any of the stories that these films are based on, to be honest. But let's talk about the movie and what it's all about. So this is like I mentioned, an anthology film, 3 movies, and you have a kind of a horror host here, played by a porn actress, giving a kind of Elvira-esque horror host thing. That's actually a comic book character herself, the actual character that she's playing here. But she's more or less just introducing the films with a couple of gore scenes. There's no actual wraparound story, per se. The first actual story is certainly the most surreal. We have a woman with gigantic boobs who has eyes on the end of her nipples, essentially. And she's kind of getting rebuffed by men because of this, I should probably expect. No real reason why she has eyes as nipples, but there you go. Anyway, she cries and her tears end up falling on this really badly CGI'd spider. And this spider turned into some type of demonic man spider. And this creature, it's all set in France where no one actually speaks French but has wonky French accents, goes out while she's asleep and kills people. Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a weird one. Anyway, the second story, I would say, is probably the most sensible narrative, has the most grounded narrative, and this features a female serial killer who slices her victims' faces off a la Leatherface and wears them, and she targets beautiful women generally at strip clubs and things like this because she has scars all over her face, and she's pursued by the police. And the third movie, which is the most ambitious production-wise, is a kind of a fantasy medieval story, clearly based on the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, where we have a queen who bathes in the blood of virgins to restore her kind of youth and keep her beautiful. And like I've said, this is maybe the most ambitious with the most sort of external shots and things like this, and maybe props and that kind of stuff. So let's delve into a little bit of a more detail here, what works, and kind of go into maybe what works with the particular stories. And then we'll talk a bit about what doesn't. So there's no doubt that this movie features a bevy of beauties. There are many attractive women here, all who look like they generally probably should have been strippers or porn stars or the like. But there are, you can't take away from the fact that there's many, many attractive women, most of whom who get at least topless here. So this will remind you a lot of the kind of the heavy metal animated movies, if you've seen them, also based on magazines. And I feel that's the nearest comparison if you had to kind of say, but obviously a live action version. But clearly this doesn't have the filmmaking talents maybe behind the heavy metal 2 movies that they were available. Now, interesting is that there's that Frank Frazetta connection as well, that if you're familiar with the comic books. But anyway, I get kind of sidetracked. Yeah, lots of attractive women, but this movie's not going to do anything for feminism. Let me just put it like that. And this is certainly an interesting, almost kind of surreal experimental art movie, the first one at least. It's certainly a bizarre film, and it reminds me a lot of music videos. Now, if you are familiar with Glenn Danzig, you may have seen some of his music videos, and it is strikingly similar to some of those. Maybe I feel maybe this is where Glenn Danzig's got his ideas for directing, but it has a weird kind of like music video feel to it, which again, this movie is so bizarre. I think it's one of those things you can probably put on the background and people will just be like wondering what it is and have weird imagery. Glenn Danzig clearly likes to have interesting shots, but I feel maybe that it works better as photos rather than a moving image, because there are a lot of this movie is people kind of posing in particular ways and the camera kind of lingering on them. So there are a few shots here that I would say probably look okay. And for a low budget, I would say that at least the last film is relatively ambitious and has actually some fairly good, or fun at least, kind of like costumes and props and things like that. But man, I am struggling for positives with this one, because this film is one of the worst films I've ever seen. As much as I quite enjoy Glenn Danzig as a musical artist, and actually, I say I quite like some of his comics, maybe directing is not his forte. I mean, he's following kind of Rob Zombie's footprints from going from music into movies here. But I don't think Glenn Danzig has the skill here of even Rob Zombie. Just on a technical level, before we get into anything else, this film is so poorly made. There's so many like extended sequences of really nothing or of the same shot, and then what we have even kind of like zoom ins and then zoom outs again and in the same shot. Like, I don't know, it looks like a wedding video. It's on a technical level, it's just not cut very well. It's actually edited by Alex Cox apparently, but I think the editing is terrible. I've got to be honest with you. In all three of the films. Individually, the first film I would say is the weakest. It just doesn't make... I mean, there's just not a lick of sense in this movie. Now, you could argue that it's supposed to be somewhat abstract, and that's great, but, you know, I feel people can defend this and just, oh, it's art, you don't understand it, but it's just not very good, unfortunately. I get that it's obviously a low budget, but the acting is terrible. Why is it set in France with no one kind of, like, speaking French? Just, you know, why have that? And although there are lots of kind of like attractive ladies here, the acting is a little on the weak side. If I'm trying to be kind here, the actual makeup design of the creature doesn't look too bad, but they've insisted in giving him like mannequin arms, and it just looks stupid. And the story of this one is just ridiculous with some awful CGI. Sometimes less is more, is all I would say. This to me was the weakest one, because I didn't really feel it had any redeeming features. The second story I feel has the strongest story, although that's not saying much really, because I feel the story is still pretty weak, but at least it's coherent. We have a female serial killer, as I've mentioned, and I've got to say, out of this whole film, maybe she does the best performance, but again, it's not a lot of competition here. It's at least has a somewhat of an arc, this one at least I can say, but it's really... Again, it's poor. The acting here, generally speaking, is poor. The gore effects are a mixed bag. There are a couple of shots where we see faces that have previously been taken off, which don't look too bad. But when we actually see, you know, a shot where the face is getting cut off, it's just terrible, unfortunately. And to be honest with you, it still has the problem of a massively extended scenes that just go on for too long. A lot of this is set in a kind of a strip club, but it just seems to go on forever. And then the third one is the Elizabeth Bathory style film. And this is, like I said, this at least has a few external shots and kind of establishing shots and things like that. And has a bit more of a kind of variation in kind of locales here. But the acting is so OTT here. It's just, I mean, it's like porn acting. There are ex-porn stars that work on this, or current porn stars, but this is just like porn acting 101. And there's no story in this one. It's literally just Elizabeth Bathory-style character kind of going through her day, sacrificing virgins. But there's no actual plot. It's just her killing girls, basically, and kind of bathing in their blood, and that's it. There's no plot to it. It's just her doing her thing. So this movie is just a car wreck. It really is. I mean, I've actually tried to be somewhat kind in this review, to be honest. But man, this was hard to sit through. And this is someone who quite likes Glenn Danzig's music and quite likes, you know, low-budget horror films, and even quite likes the comics that this is based on. And man, this was a tough watch. Maybe there's some value in just watching it as a little bit of a oddity and kind of like a morbid curiosity, but it's a car wreck. I mean, like I said, this can be compared with The Room. It really can. So 3 out of 10. I legitimately can't say this. There's much good here, but you may want to watch it just out of some sort of morbid curiosity, or unless you're a huge Glenn Danzig fan. I saw some reviews on IMDb that gave it 10 out of 10, and just like, man, be objective, come on. 3 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.